1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. I'm your host, Andreas Werner, songwriter, composer, and record producer. My guest today is my good friend, Lenny LeBlanc. Lenny is a Dove Award-winning songwriter, singer, and musician from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. He was born in Massachusetts and raised in Florida before following his good friend Pete Carr to Muscle Shoals. Carr, by that time, was the lead guitar player of the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section after a stint in the pre-Allman Brothers band Hourglass. LeBlanc and Carr joined forces and had a hit in 1977 with the song Falling. They were also the opening act on a tour that claimed the lives of several Lynyrd Skynyrd members, but they got away clean because they were on a bus instead. In the 1980s, Lenny established himself as a Christian singer and songwriter with over a dozen albums to his name. Songs he wrote include Above All, You First, and Old Timer, which he co-wrote with my good friend, the late Donnie Fritts. Lenny's singing and playing can be heard on records by Etta James, The Supremes, Joan Baez, Roy Orbison, and Dan Penn on his great Do Right Man album. So, without any further ado, please welcome Lenny LeBlanc to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. Lenny, thank you so much for being my guest today. It's been so wonderful to get to know you and to get to be around you when you perform, because it really is a spiritual or a meaningful experience, because you just radiate positivity when you perform and when you talk about your craft, and it's always great to be able to share that with you.
Well, it's great to be here and be a guest on your show.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, let's go way back. And you were born in Massachusetts, but moved to Daytona Beach, Florida as a young kid.
Yeah. You know, my mom, when she was in her teens, back in the 40s, her and her girlfriends would hitchhike to Florida during the winter because they hated the cold weather. And it was safe to hitchhike back then. You know, they said truck drivers would pick them up and take them where they, down to the beach. And so she really developed a love for Florida. And my dad was one of those kind of guys. He was in World War II, and he was content to stay in Massachusetts, but she was always the mover and the shaker, and she said, We're going to Florida. And I remember we had a mattress on top of the old car, and they said we had $100, and we took off to Florida.
Start a new life.
Yeah, start a new life.
That's great. So what are some of your earliest memories connected to music?
Probably my earliest was when we went back to Massachusetts one summer to visit, because I had my mom's family had 13 and my dad's family had 13, and they all got married, so I had 50-something aunts and uncles and over 70 first cousins. So we went to visit them, and we went to one of my aunt's houses, and she had a piano in the bedroom, in the basement. And I remember wandering down there and just going over to that piano and picking out nursery rhymes. I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
All the other kids were out playing, and I stayed there for 2 hours. I was enthralled by that piano, It's the first time I'd really been around any kind of instrument per se. And so when we got back home, I said, Mom, I want a piano or organ or something, and we were poor. My dad was a bag boy at the grocery store, and she was a waitress, so we couldn't afford much surely not music lessons or an instrument. You know?
Yeah, and you didn't have the $29 little piano that back then.
Oh yeah, and I remember we were at auction one night, and there was a little chord organ about maybe 2 feet long, and I just knew they were going to buy it for me. It was $10, and they didn't. And I would cry and lay in
And
bed.
at that time, that was substantial.
Oh yeah,
too.
$10 was a lot of money back then. This would have been 1958, something like that. And so I realized I wasn't going to get an instrument, and so it just kind of left me. The desire left me, and then in my teens, I was 15 years old, and we were into surfing, down on the east coast of Florida. That's what we did when we got out of school in the afternoons. So a friend of mine, he had a car, so we went to the beach, and we came home, stopped by his house, and his little brother and several of his little friends were sitting in the living room. They were playing songs off the radio. They had 3 electric guitars. They were playing House of the Rising Sun by the Animals, and can't remember another song they were playing. And they looked at my buddy and I, and they said, "Hey, why don't you guys come over here and sing?" I thought, sing? I said, "We're surfers. We're not singers." So no way we were going to go over there. And they kept playing, and I was really liking it. And so eventually I went over there and picked up the sheet music. I knew the song from the radio, I started singing, and they looked at me and they said, "Wow, you sound really good." I said, "Really?" They said, "Yeah, let's put a band together and enter the talent show." I said, "Talent show? You think I've got talent?" They said, "Yeah." So I didn't know what I was getting into. I was like, I'd never done anything in front of anybody. And so it was a little talent show at junior high, and there was about 300 people in that cafeteria. So I had my hands in my pockets and my back to the audience. I was petrified. Yeah. And we won the talent show. And then they got really excited. They said, "You need to get a bass." I said, "What's a bass?" Had no idea what it was, And so I marched myself down to Eckerd's drugstore and got a job washing dishes. And 3 months later, I bought a precision bass. It's 1965. Wish I still had it today.
Yeah.
It'd be worth a little bit of money. And then, kind of just learned things from them. Never had any lessons. I took half a year of music theory in high school, just enough to be dangerous. But about 2 years later, I was making a living in the clubs, and that's kind of how it got started. By accident, really.
Yeah.
Not really, but seems that way,
Yeah. But isn't it funny, like sometimes, it was kind of a coincidence, I guess, that you even hung out with those guys and they
that
asked
was the
you.
last thing on my radar was, getting in a band.
Yeah.
And I was really wanting to be an architect, to be honest with you, because I love building things and designing things. That's what I really was into back then. That was kind of where my focus was going to go.
Yeah. And now you get to do that too, which is great.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Did you meet Pete Carr around the same time, or when did you meet?
When I was about 17, I met Pete. He was a year older than me, and he lived about maybe 10 miles south of me in South Daytona. And the Allman Brothers grew up there in Daytona too, as well, in their later teens, and went to high school there before they went on the road. And I remember going to see them as the Allman Joys. They were a cover band, but they were so good. Yeah. And as soon as I started playing, that's when I really, began to see them. And then eventually, after they had a band called the Hourglass.
Yes, and then
California.
Pete became a member of that.
Pete was a member of that. He was the bass player of that band, even though he was sort of like Dwayne's understudy, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And so he played in that band, and they did a couple of records for the Liberty label. And I think right about the time that broke up, I think Dwayne came here to Muscle Shoals, and Pete came back to Daytona, where I was. And we put a band together and played around town and played in the area. And then eventually Dwayne, I think, from here he went to Jacksonville and put the Allman Brothers together. And he was rehearsing with them, and he'd come home on the weekends to Daytona to his mom's house, and he would jam with me and Pete in our band. And that was like an amazing highlight when he would come to town and come in our little club after it was closed, and we'd jam,
Yeah.
because he was so good. He was like, he was, like 5'8", maybe 5'7", 5'8", probably weighed 130 pounds. But when he walked into a room, every eye was drawn to him. I'd never seen anybody with that much charisma, to be that small in stature. And when he got on stage, you played about 3 times better than your ability. He just brought everybody up. He was some kind of person, amazing person.
Yeah.
So that's how Pete and I kind of hooked up.
And then not that much later, he got recruited to play with the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section.
Yeah, and I never got to ask him about how he got here. I'm sure Dwayne had something to do with it. Yeah. And Johnny Sandlin probably too. Mm-hmm. And getting him up here. Yeah.
And were you in touch at that time? Did you have an idea what his role was
Off
here?
And on, and I would see Dwayne because I was living in Cincinnati playing with a band. And we had a little regional record deal from Nashville Records in Nashville. And
what was the band called?
Whale Feathers. It was like a psychedelic blues band.
All right. I don't think I ever knew that.
But yeah, it was kind of weird music. I didn't really like it, but that was a gig, And then I stayed there for 3 years. So when Dwayne would come through with the Allman Brothers, I would hang out with Dwayne after the show, before and after. And then, so I kind of would kept in touch with them. And then after Dwayne died, the Allman Brothers would still come to Cincinnati once a year. So one time Greg was there, and I hung out with Greg afterwards. And I was really tired of playing in that band, and Greg said, well, why don't you come to Macon, move down there, and you can be in my road band. Because he was going to he just did a solo album, and he was going to put a band together and do a small tour. So I picked up and I moved to Macon. And my wife, I had a young daughter, 2 years old, and I would stay home and watch my daughter, and my wife was an LPN, and she got a job at the hospital. So Greg would come and get me. And it was really wild because when we came to town, we were looking for a house to rent or just an apartment or something, And so we looked in the paper, and the first thing I saw was this like half of an old house downstairs of an old house, and so I rented that house. There's like 3 rooms. So Greg came over to get me one day, and he walks in and he looks around and he says, "I'll wait for you in the car." And that was the big house where they all lived.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I just blow into town and that looks like a neat place to rent.
And now it's an Allman Brothers museum.
Yeah. So that was so wild, But so Greg would come to get me. We'd go out and eat, or we'd go to the studio and play and jam a little bit. But he was in no hurry to put a band together. And it's like 3 months, and I was like itching to do something, Yeah. And that's when I called Pete.
Did anything ever get recorded that you did?
No, we just would go to the studio and jam, Yeah. And I was so green and young, I don't know if I could have even got the gig, when he did it. It was 9 months later, and he finally put a band together. But he was very gracious and, hang out and spend time with me, Yeah. And that's the last time I saw him, honestly. And so then I called Pete, and I said, "Pete, do you think there's anything for me in Muscle Shoals?" He said, "Why don't you come up here and just check it out?" So we came up, stayed a week, went back and got our stuff and moved up, and that was 1973.
Yeah, and the rest is history. So, and we'll talk about, the record that you guys did together in a minute here, because you made a solo album first.
Yeah.
Right? And you had a single with a song that two buddies of yours wrote, right?
Right.
Which became a hit much later.
Much later, yeah.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about, maybe your first record kind of.
Yeah. So when I first moved here, I didn't have a job. My wife got a job at a veterinarian hospital, and so we had to live with Pete. He fed us and housed us for 6 months before I could get on my feet. And so I was starting to write songs. Pete and I wrote a few songs. So we did a few demos. He played them for Jerry Wexler. And 3 weeks later, I had a record deal, solo record deal, on Big Tree Atlantic. And so one of the songs was Sharing the Night Together. And one of the first writers I met here was Eddie Struzik. Eddie was doing some little engineering gig at Music Mill Studios and writing on the side. He was actually a writer for Cartier Music there. And so him and Ava wrote this song.
Ava Aldrich.
Ava Aldrich, yeah. So when I heard that song, I said, man, that's a hit. And so that was one of the first songs I recorded. And oddly enough, Arthur Alexander recorded the same song the same week. And he was on Monument label. And I was on Big Tree Atlantic, and they released the singles at the same time. So some radio stations were playing mine, some were playing his, and they both got in the charts like in the maybe 60s or 70s. And I guess they really just canceled each other out because the radio stations they didn't know which one to play.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a shame that one of us didn't have a hit, and a few years later, Dr. Hook.
Sharing the Night Together was a big hit for them.
Huge hit,
yeah. And I don't know if that happened around the same time or a little bit later, but you've also became a pretty in-demand session player. And singer. I think maybe singer even more than player.
Yeah, I started out playing a bass on quite a few records, and then but I really wanted to be a songwriter, and so I kind of transitioned to guitar, and Bob Ray came back to town, and he started getting a lot of the work, and it was really a good transition for me to kind of move away from that and start doing more background vocals, and I would do a lot at Fame and do some Muscle Shoals Sound, so.
Yeah, Wishbone too, right?
And Wishbone, yeah. I played on all Wishbone stuff as a bass player. And on that first record, there was another song called Hound Dog Man.
Yeah, that's right.
And a guy in Tuscaloosa wrote it, Tommy, I can't remember his last name. But that song was about Elvis, but it was recorded 6 months and written probably a year before he died.
Yeah.
But it was a really cool song, and I really liked it, and so I recorded it. And then when Elvis died, Atlantic repackaged the record and
made it a title.
Yeah. So there's two versions of that album out there. One's Lenny LeBlanc, and then one's Lenny LeBlanc Hound Dog Man.
Yeah.
And they flew it to every station in the country overnight. And there was probably about 5 singles out that week that he died, and they all kind of went in the charts and then fell out.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that they did that, That was that was a different day in the music business, when they do stuff like that just on a whim.
Yeah.
Overnight. Press singles overnight,
Yeah, and some of that stuff became real huge too.
Oh yeah. So that's kind of wild.
Yeah. And I guess around the same time you did your solo record, actually Pete made a solo record too.
Yeah,
right?
because he had a deal on Atlantic.
And you were on that one too.
I was on the first one, Not a Word on It, with Chuck Leavell and different players.
Yeah. So what made you actually join forces as artists?
Really, it was the record label's idea. We were not really thinking about that. And, because we were, such good friends and everything, and musically kind of in the same, wavelength or whatever, they thought it'd be a great idea. And plus, Loggins and Messina, and there was quite a few duos out there, and duos were popular, and I think they were thinking on the commercial side,
Sure.
So.
And it worked.
Yeah, it worked.
Because Fallen was a big hit.
Yeah, big hit. Bigger than it appeared in the charts, because back then, the way they did the charts were, they were determined by airplay, mostly.
Yeah. And
not as much sales, and you had to have all that airplay concentrated at one time to push you into the top 5. We had 4 BG records in front of us, was the first hurdle. And then it was in the charts for 27 weeks. So it would come up in the 70s, and then go up to the 60s, fall back down to the 70s, come up to the 50s, fall back to the 60s. It would go up and down, up and down, up and down. And it finally went, it was number 1 in every major market in the country, because we were on tour, and we'd be in Miami one week, and they'd say, oh, it's number 1 in every station here. 3 weeks later, we'd be in Atlanta, number 1 in every station here. And then in New York, Chicago, everywhere, LA, every station in LA, number one, 2 months ago. So you had to get all that concentrated at one time. So it's a lot bigger record than it appeared.
Yeah. And you wrote it with Eddie Struth.
Yeah, Eddie Struth again.
Do you have any memories regarding to coming up with it?
Oh yeah, he had the verse. He had to think about winter when I was with her and the snow was falling down. That's all he had. And so we finished that verse, and I said, I got an idea for the chorus. And so I came up with the chorus, and then we kind of finished it after that. But yeah, it was written. We probably wrote it in about an hour, and both of us knew it was a hit.
Yeah.
You know.
And I'm almost sorry that I ask you this, because I know you've had to tell this story many times. I guess it's two parts. First of all, you got to perform it on TV,
Right.
and then you open on this fateful Lynyrd Skynyrd tour where the plane went down.
Yeah.
Can you maybe summary of that era
Yeah.
promoting this record?
We did American Bandstand, and Before Falling was a single. We had another single out called Something About You. It was a Four Tops cover. And so after that show, we had the same manager as Skynyrd. He managed the Rolling Stones. Skynyrd, 38 Special, and us. I think we were his write-off. And he would, he bought us equipment, and he was really great. And a guy named Peter Rudge, an English guy, a great guy, and really helped us. And so that's how we got on the Skynyrd tour, was through Peter. And we knew the guys, we knew Skynyrd, because they recorded here, and I'd played a lot of the same clubs in Atlanta that they played years before that, and would run into them. And so yeah, we started out in Statesboro, Georgia, and at a college there, and then we went to the Miami Sportatorium, and that's where a girl jumped from the balcony and died that night during that concert. And then we went to Tampa Bay Civic Center the next night, and then from there to Lakeland Civic Center. And then from there, we split up, and Pete and I went to Daytona Beach and headlined our own show there in our hometown. And they went to Greenville, South Carolina. And then we were supposed to meet back up in Baton Rouge the next day, and that's where the plane crashed on the way to Baton Rouge. Yeah. Sad day.
Sure. So, if you don't mind, the next step I would like to talk about is, I think, really important for you as a man, and then as a result of it as a musician, and that is, along with a bunch of other musicians actually here from Muscle Shoals, you felt you would like to change your lifestyle, and you found God in the process, or found Him again. So would you mind talking a little bit about that experience or transition?
Yeah, I love to tell that story. That's the best story of my life right there. So, after LeBlanc and Carr, Pete really didn't do a lot of touring after the Skynyrd thing, and so I pretty much did it myself and had a band. We did, we drove 5,000 or 6,000 miles in the back of Bonneville, Pontiac Bonneville cars, and so it came time to do another record, and we did a LeBlanc and Carr record, and then after that, we parted ways because there really wasn't a LeBlanc and Carr anymore, because Pete wanted to produce more than play on the road.
Did it ever come out? Because I'm only
No,
aware
it never
of
came
one.
out, because it was, Gary Baker was in the band, Tom Flora was in the band, and him and Tom were writing songs, kind of like Talking Heads kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it was really so different than what I would write. It was almost like a Frankenstein record. It was like two personalities to it. And I told Atlantic, I said, this is not me. I said, why don't you put it out on them, and I'll do a solo record, But anyway, so I eventually left Atlantic and then signed with Muscle Shoals Sound Records. And Barry Beckett did a pop record on me. We had a couple chart singles. And then one night I was laying in bed after I think I come home from a small tour, and this friend of mine that I grew up with had been to Vietnam, and he was home, and he had begun smuggling drugs. He would smuggle thousands of pounds of marijuana from the islands and different places. He and his partners had they had planes leased, they had boats, ship captains and pilots. I mean, they were big time. They weren't just dope dealers; they were smugglers. I remember they had this briefcase where they could tell if the authorities were tapping the lines and stuff. I thought, man, this is real stuff. And so he called me late one night and said, Lenny, I got saved. I've turned my life over to God. He said, I've made a mess of things, and I realized that's where I need to turn, straighten my life out. And he said, I'm going to heaven, and I want you to be there with me. Are you saved? And I thought, man, just when things are going good. I was not looking for God. That was the last thing that I was looking for. But something in his voice really intrigued me because he was such a close friend. I wanted to really know more about what happened to him, because I could tell just by the sound of his voice something really drastic had happened in his life. And so he sent me a Bible, and I started reading the Bible for the first time, really. I remember I was in the Catholic church when we went to Catholic school. I think we went on a free scholarship because I know we couldn't afford it. And so I heard a lot about God, but I never really knew how to get to God, and have a relationship with Him, because it was all just a lot of like outward kind of things, And so I started reading the Bible, and I began seeing myself in different characters, just traits that I had. I saw myself like I was reading the story about the rich young ruler that had all this stuff, but he was bankrupt inside, and the stuff had him instead of him having the stuff. And that was me. I had, a certain amount of success, and I thought, man, if I could, just get a little bit more success, I'd be happy, and it never happened. Then I saw myself at the story of the woman at the well, where she had all these relationships, and none of them worked out. That was me. I had many relationships. I thought if I could find the right person to share this with. By this time, 6 years before I'd left my young family for myself, I was eaten up with my career was my God, basically. And I just, I threw my family away, and I was eaten up with guilt from that. And then I read about God's forgiveness, and it was like 1,000 pounds lifted off my shoulders when I realized that God would forgive me for that. And man, my life just started, my heart began to change right there over a period of about a month, I guess, of just reading through the Bible and just feeling God's love just like pour over me. I'd go out on the porch and I'd just look across the street and I'd say, those trees have never looked that green. It was like scales were taken off my eyes. I began to see things in a different light. And so I didn't know how to pray. I didn't know how to come to God. I didn't know what you needed to do. I thought maybe there was going to be an angel coming to my room or something, But it wasn't anything like that. It was just a supernatural experience that I had with God, just me and Him in that house, day after day. And I began to change. And I was just a different person after that month went by. And my friends would come over and they'd say, let's go get high, I said, man, I don't know if I can get any higher than I am right now. And, and then I had sort of a dilemma because I was writing these pop songs because I had that record deal on MSS Capitol. And so they exercised the second option for a second record. So I was trying to write songs for that record, and it would start out to be a pop song, and then we'd get to the chorus and it'd be about Jesus. I thought, oh no, Capitol's not going to want these Jesus songs. And they didn't. And it wasn't that okay, now you're a Christian, you're following God, now you can't do these pop songs. It wasn't that at all. It was like, I think we need Christ followers in all those genres of music. Music is music. It's all good, And it wasn't that. It was just all I wanted to write about was this God that changed my life, because it was such an amazing experience and transition in my heart. And so, Capitol put me in suspension of my contract. That's where you can't record for anybody unless they buy your contract out. And so Christian labels, contemporary Christian music was very small back then. It was barely even a genre. And the biggest label was Sparrow Records, and they wanted to sign me. Because Following was a big hit, and I was kind of hot property, so to speak. And so they said, man, we can't afford $30,000 just for your contract. We don't spend that on our biggest artist. After making the record and everything, it was going to cost them, by the time they bought me out, it's going to cost $60,000 to make a record and buy me out. So I went for 2 years and couldn't do anything. I'd write songs, but, that's about all I could do, and I'd do sessions. And so I always made furniture and made things, so I'd get a job making building a deck for Robert Byrne or doing something for Mac, building something here and there.
Mac McAnally.
Yeah, Mac McAnally. And so I was able to scratch a living out, It was a great life decision, probably the worst career decision you could ever make, because I lost 2 years of my music career, so to speak. And man, I think it was the best. Sure, didn't get in it for the money. Some people say, oh, a lot of money in Christian music. There's no money in Christian music, and we struggled for 5 or 6 years till I started producing a little bit and kind of writing some songs that other people recorded. And I never dreamed that I would have success like I had with songwriting in Christian music.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But you mentioned you did continue to do some session singing, and I'm curious a little bit about just your perspective in that world. I think a lot of the sessions you did with Ava Aldridge and Cindy Richardson Walker, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about the dynamics, maybe what it takes to be a good, studio section.
Yeah, I think for background vocals, it's listening to each other and getting that blend, that perfect blend, and we had that, us three. We did a lot of sessions, and I remember we used to sing on all the Clarence Carter records that he did, back in the day, and all the Percy's records that were cut at Broadway. We'd sing on all those. And I remember one funny, after I came to the Lord, Ava came after me about 3 or 4 months, and then, Cindy and then Ava. So we all became, Christians within a year or so. And Will McFarlane around the same time, Rona Eads, sort of like a mini revival here in the Shoals area in the music community. And Jerry Masters, one of the great engineers. So we're doing this Clarence Carter session, and we've done a few songs, and so we get to this song, and the title of it is Why Do I Stay Here and Take This Shit From You? Clarence was playing it down, and I could tell just, sweat was popping out of Ava's forehead, and Cindy was starting to sweat, and they were like looking at me like, you gonna be the one to tell him we ain't gonna sing that. So I said, hey Clarence, why don't we sing Why Do I Stay Here? And then you finish the line out. He said, man, that's a great idea.
It worked out for everybody.
I'll never forget that. That was so funny.
Yeah. And you talk about, listening to each other,
mm-hmm.
and I guess, just a natural blend. Is this something that kind of instinctively work from the beginning of you working together, or did you have to work on it?
I think you have to work on it. Yeah, you definitely have to work on it, because you have to change the tone of your voice to fit the other people who you're singing with. So you're not like standing out, it's more of just a cohesiveness. Yeah, it's more of like one person, but like 3 parts, and that's a tough thing to do sometimes, if you're not willing to change what you do to fit the session and what's good for the song.
Yeah. And then sadly we lost Ava.
Yeah.
And besides that being, I'm sure, a huge loss for you, because you lost a friend and collaborator.
She was my co-writer. We wrote Treat Her Right together, had a #1 on Sawyer Brown, and she wrote so many of my Christian songs with me. Yeah.
And in regard to the section, I mean, that is a huge loss there too. And how difficult was it to continue and maybe find somebody else to step
Well, I think
into
at that point we weren't doing as many background sessions because I was traveling a lot, and I think it transitioned to Marie, Cindy, and maybe I'm not sure who they used to use, but there again there was not a lot of work at that time too, because it was sort of a downturn in the industry around that time. So a combination of things happened to where it just kind of took a different route, so to speak.
Yeah. So you mentioned about, mentioned that you had to wait your contract out for a couple of years, basically.
Yeah.
But then you were free to go and pursue your Christian artist career.
Yeah.
So how was that experience? Was that like, I mean, just kind of logistically, was that a very different experience than your like secular artist career? Or was it similar, just in different venues?
Yeah, it was very different. I remember I was working on a job with my brother. We were building a kind of a little overhang over a door in Florence, and I was reading this magazine called Contemporary Christian Magazine. It was like it was kind of the music magazine for Christian music, and there was a little quarter-page ad in there for Heartland Records. So I sent my little cassette tape down to them, and they flew me down there to Orlando, and they had me sing for a youth group at a church. And that was really kind of the first time I'd sang in a church for anybody other than the little church I was going to, So I was like, wow, this is really wild. It's like nobody's talking. They're all looking at me and they're all sober, So it was quite a different take on things. But oddly enough, the guy that owned Heartland Records also owned Full Sail University, John Phelps. And the school at that time was only about 120 students. And they were struggling. They had a little motorhome, and they had a little building rented in Altamont Springs, then Orlando, and they would rent studios for their students to do their labs in.
Wasn't Jerry Masters teaching there for a little while too?
I don't think so. He might have gone down once or so, but he was not teaching there. And so John and I have remained friends through the years. Now the school's like, it's like 12,000 online, 12,000 on campus. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah. So you started writing Christian songs.
Yeah.
I guess probably first for your own purpose, for your own record.
Right.
But how did some of these songs started to attract like other artists? Is that something you pursued, or did they just kind of discover off of your record? How did that work?
Well, Integrity Music was the label that I was signed to, Integrity, and they were in Mobile. And so they started out, they had a magazine called New Wine Magazine, and it was before kind of worship and praise music was really even a thought, And they said, we need to just send out a letter to all our subscribers. About 7,000 people subscribe to their magazine. Would you like to get a cassette tape every 2 months for like $7? So they had 4,000 subscriptions the first month. So every 2 months they would send out a cassette, and their mailing list grew to like over 250,000 people. Every 2 months they were sending out 250,000 cassettes. Because churches were just hungry for more contemporary worship. People were singing hymns or kind of camp meeting songs, and that was what inspired me to try to write songs. Because when I first got into going to church, they were like singing like old time gospel songs. Like all day long I've been with Jesus. It has been a wonderful day. It's just they were singing songs about God, but not singing songs to God.
Okay.
That was a difference. And so I said, this is great stuff, and I love the old hymns, but I said, if I ask my friends to come here, they're not going to relate to any of this music. And that's when I started writing worship songs. And so Integrity, I started first of all singing background on a lot of the recordings, and then they asked me to be the lead singer on one of them, like the worship leader guy on the tape. And so then I started doing solo records for them, and they were really big in getting the records, the CDs overseas. So they had a whole marketing team and overseas label and everything. So they got into all the nations, and that's how my songs got into those other countries. And then they would put out compilation CDs like every 6 months. So one of my last CDs was called Above All, and had the song Above All on it. So about 6 months after that, no, about 3 years after that record came out, my version of it, which didn't really sell, they put a compilation record out, and they called it Above All, because Above All was being sung in a lot of churches, kind of just smooth, just kind of coming up.
Yeah.
And so about that time, Michael W. Smith had planted a church in Franklin, and he was leading worship on Sunday morning, plus he was trying to preach too. So he was looking for songs to sing in the service. And he stumbled on that CD that had Above All on it. And he started singing it in church. And then I'm coming home one Sunday morning, and it was George W. Bush's first inaugural prayer service, when he got elected the first time. It was in the National Cathedral. So I'm coming home from the store Sunday morning, and my daughter's in the driveway yelling for me to come in. She said, "He's singing your song, he's singing your song." I thought, who's singing what song? And I missed it. And so Michael W. walked out there with the lyrics on a sheet of paper and actually sang the wrong lyrics in that National Cathedral on TV, And a few months later, he recorded it. And
With the right lyrics.
With the right lyrics. Yeah. Randy Travis, not so much.
But that song won a Dove Award.
Yeah,
too,
for the best recorded song of the year. Mm-hmm.
And would you say that's your best known Christian song?
Yeah, that one, and another one called "There's None Like You" was nominated for a Dove, but it didn't win.
Okay. And I think there's another one that I really like that you wrote with Mac.
Oh yeah. Looking Up, or You First, maybe?
I'm talking about You First, but there's
yeah.
two good ones. How did you? I know you connected with him a long time ago, probably around Wishbone. Maybe you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, so I moved here in '73, and then Mac moved here in '75.
And we're talking about Mac McAnally.
Mac McAnally, yeah. So he moved in '75 and became affiliated with Wishbone as a writer and an artist. So I would sing on all Mac's records, and he would play and sing on mine, or we would always get together and do something together, And so whenever he got a gospel idea, he would always call me and want to write it, So I was in Florida, and he called and said, "Man, I got this idea called the title. All I got is a title, You First." And you know how when you're a kid, you think of yourself first, and then when you get older, you realize you need to put others first, and whether that's God or he said, "I don't know," and I'm just thinking in my head. So I got back and I started working on it, and I thought, what if it went a little bit different? And it was a scenario where it was two kids, and they were crossing the river, and they would, you dare each other, you first, And then what if in the second verse it was two soldiers that were brothers in a war, and they were both wounded, and one, said to the other one, "You go to the helicopter first, you first, and I'll be right behind you." So I had the first verse and the chorus, and I got together with Mac, and he went, "Oh my gosh, I never thought about doing it this way, And of course, we wrote the second verse, and he wrote the bridge, and it was just. He called me about it about 6 months later because, see, Kenny Chesney is a big fan of Mac McAnally's.
Yes, and he's recorded a lot of his
songs.
songs.
Yeah, he loves Mac McAnally. So that was our plan, was to get it to Kenny. So Mac calls me about 6 months later and says, "Lenny, what's the maddest you ever been at me?" I said, "Mac, I could never get mad at you." He said, "My label's wanting to put this out on me." And he said, "It's going to be the kiss of death." Because, nobody buys, nobody plays Mac on the radio, much. And so kind of one of those unsung heroes, in the music business. He's a huge success, but not commercially.
Yeah.
Other people cut his songs, and he does great. Yeah, but so it wasn't a hit, but it's a special song, and I sing it everywhere I go, and I've gotten to sing it at several places. One was in Birmingham for 500 disabled vets, and that was a huge time in my life, a great opportunity to bless those guys, and there wasn't a dry eye in that place when I sang it.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that your Christian music career enabled you to see the world, and you got to sing for probably communities that you would have never even dreamt you would ever meet.
Never. I'll get letters all through the 80s from Kenya, from India, emails, by the droves. I'm thinking, how do they know my music over there? It's just so weird. And it was because of integrity. They had distribution in all of those countries. And so all through Africa, they were singing my songs, Don Moen's songs, and a few others. And so I got a call from this guy in Nigeria one day, an email actually, want me to come over there and do a small tour. I thought, Nigeria, that's where you get murdered on the street. So I tell my friends, they said, man, you don't need to go there. They'll like hold you at gunpoint between the airport and your hotel on the road. They'll just rob you blind. And that friend, that Nigerian guy said, he just laughed. So he said, I'll give you some names of people that I brought over, and they were people that I knew. And so I took a band over there, and it was just unbelievable. I thought, what am I doing here? They've got such incredible musicians and singers over there. It's just crazy. And I've been there probably 15 times. I've been to 6 or 7 other countries in Africa, all through Asia. I've flown over 3 million air miles and have been probably almost 30 countries. And it was all because of the songs, just kind of made a way for me.
Yeah.
I've been in Africa with 400,000 people singing above all. When 400,000 people sing your song, you pretty much sing it the way they're used to singing it. Because in Africa, I don't know if you've ever heard Africans sing, they sing loud. And they're not like First Presbyterian on a Sunday morning where only 3 old ladies are singing and nobody else is singing, you go to church there and the whole church is singing loud. They just drown out the PA almost. They're so loud. So when they're singing your song at a big event like that, you pretty much just hop on the train and follow them. Yeah, it's quite an experience.
Yeah. So thank you, first of all, for sharing all of this. But there's one thing I feel we really need to talk about.
Okay.
And that is like a person that is close to our hearts and a song that's close to our hearts. And that is the one, the only Donnie Fritts, and the song you wrote with him called Old Timer. Would you mind talking a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. First of all, Donnie and I met back in the probably the 80s. I knew who Donnie was, but I never really met him, and he had a kind of a health crisis where he had to have a kidney transplant, and my daughter was about 10 or 11, and for some reason she would pray for Donnie every night, and that really touched his heart, that she would pray for him, and he got well, and we, he had an experience with God back then, and it changed his heart, and so we would get together and different times. He said, we need to write a song together. And we'd say that every year, or every 6 months we'd see each other. Never did it. Finally, one morning I was working on a song that I'd worked on for a couple of years. And it was kind of a pop R&B song. And I thought, man, I need to get Donnie to help me finish this. So I called him and I said, man, come over and help me finish this song. So he came over, and when you write with certain people, you got a chemistry, and others you write with, there's just not a chemistry there.
Sure.
You just don't hit it off, And man, we hit it off so good that he was excited. We finished that song, and he said, man, before you left, he said, man, I got this idea called Old Timer. He said, I wanted to put it on my single lock record, but he said, I never did write it. And then he just left. And then next morning he called all excited. He said, "Man, you want to ride again?" I said, "Yeah." He said, as soon as he said that old timer the day before, I saw the whole story in my head. And I was like whispering this selfish prayer, I was like, "Oh God, please let him ask me to write that with him." And the next day, the next morning he called. He said, "Let's write that old timer." I went, "Thank you, Jesus." So I had half the song written before he even got there.
All right.
And we finished it, and he sang the demo, and we ended up writing, I think, I know you've written with him some. I think I wrote 5 or 6 songs, and they're probably some of the last songs that he wrote in that last year or two.
Yeah.
And we had such a great time when we write.
And he loved the song. And then, do you know the story about how he got to Willie?
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind sharing that?
Yeah. So, he helped Willie, I think, get his career going in the early days. And so he had Willie's phone number, of course. And so he called him after we got the demo done. And Donnie didn't do email, So he got his email address, and I emailed it to Willie. And the next day he called Donnie, and he said, "I'm recording this song." So, 3 or 4 months go by, thinking, Willie's 84. You never know what could happen,
Yeah.
And then he finally did record it. And that was great. And I told Donnie, I said, we probably won't make any money, but it's Willie.
That's right.
How many people get a Willie Nelson cut? Not many. So that was a great experience, great honor.
Yeah, and so he did a couple albums for Single Lock, and then he always told me, I want to do one more album, and I want to call the Old Timer. And but we kind of you're here with Single Lock, they're taking care of you here at the moment, and it's like, yeah, it's good, but I don't want to wait. Let's just cut some stuff.
Yeah, right.
Because I've been kind of asking, hey, I would so love to make a record with you. And he's, I want to make a record with you too. I'm just kind of occupied,
Yeah.
And so anyway, we went in and started cutting stuff.
Yeah,
and we did a really cool version of Old Timer.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the title track of his
Awesome.
last album that's going to come out sometime next year.
Awesome. Can't wait.
And it's 90% true to what he wanted, like word by word, play by play.
Yeah.
And I just kind of tried to finish it, going into his head as much as I can, to kind of knowing what he liked, and he needed a little bit of New Orleans horns there, just kind of like, what would Donnie do?
Yeah.
And I think, it could be a pretty good idea of spending so much time with him, and in the cars, going to gigs or writing, and
you guys spent a lot of time together.
Yeah, it was the gig of my life. It really was.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So we're almost at the end, but I want to make sure that I kind of, capture who you are. So if you feel like something we didn't touch on, maybe we can add that, or something you're excited you're working on at the moment. I know, this is basically about the music, but it's also about the man, and I want to make sure that people know that you're an incredible, I don't even know what I should call it, house builder.
Designer, designer,
Designer, because this house and studio you live in here is just incredible, and I think everybody kind of thought the same, and now you're like, everybody wants you to build them a mansion or a house, or
Well, at my age, I don't want to build them. I want to draw them.
Yeah, but you're still the mastermind behind the.
I think creative people, a lot of times you'll see, for instance, Bob Dylan. Not that I'm any kind of even close to Bob Dylan, but he builds iron gates. I don't know if you've ever seen his artwork. He's amazing. And he does all this metal work. And I think that creative part of you might take a different path at times in your life. You've seen some actors begin to paint after they quit acting, or they go. I call it a different stream. It's all that stream of creativity, but it flows down a different path.
Yeah. When you said that you kind of had to stop for a couple of years and said you had to do kind of divert some of that energy. It's almost reminding me a little bit of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the beginning, we can't hit the road, we can't record.
Right.
What are we going to do now?
Yeah.
You either write more songs or what you said. What is a different creative outlet where I can have a similar experience?
Yeah, and gave a lot of people opportunity where they would do house concerts and they would, get a whole new crop of fans, through these online concerts and stuff. That was pretty interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with me and sharing all your great stories and imparting your wisdom on me.
Well, it's been fun. Yeah, thank you.
And I just wish you all the best for whatever's ahead in the world of song and in the world of designing beautiful buildings.
Thank you. I feel the same for you.
Thank you. And that was my conversation with the great Lenny LeBlanc. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, you might want to go back and check some of the previous episodes featuring many great songwriters, musicians, and record producers, including quite a few folks from Muscle Shoals. So also make sure you subscribe and like a podcast wherever you're listening to, and if you have any comments or requests, just send me a message. I would love to hear from you. But that's it for today. Be safe, take care of yourself, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye-bye. Crazy Chester Radio Hour was created and produced by me, Andreas Werner, producer, songwriter, composer with a Muscle Shoals heart. The theme song is performed by Jimmy Hall of Wet Willie and the Funky Chester Rhythm Section. It was recorded at Creative Workshop Studio in Nashville, Tennessee. You can find out more about the podcast and myself at crazychesterrecords.com or on Instagram at crazychesterrecords.